A royal state affair was planned. Invitations were sent out. The banquet was in full swing. Music, dancing, showgirls, drinking, the whole gala affair. So they brought out the consecrated vessels that they had obtained when they looted the temple at Jerusalem. Belshazzar's impieties had gone too far. Suddenly there is a mysterious writing on the wall of the palace. All it took to scare the daylights out of the king was a finger writing on the wall. All it took was 4 words. All of this was written in the secret language employed only in the king's court. Daniel interpreted it to mean that Belshazzar's time was up and that the Medes and the Persians would prevail. Before the sun comes up, the king is lying in a pool of blood, and Babylon had passed into the hands of the Medes and of the Persians. And now for my exposition of chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine before the 1,000. It has been 25 years since the last episode was written regarding the Nebuchadnezzars. Belshazzar was only acting as king because his father, Nabonidus, was actually king but was conducting war in another part of the country. A new king has come to the throne, and his name is Belshazzar. He was called king, but in reality was regent king. That means temporarily serving as king while his father is engaged in war. He planned a royal state affair and invited 1,000 guests. The most important and influential people in the kingdom were invited. No laborer, no peasant, no ordinary citizen was invited. Just the rich and famous received an invitation. Verse 2. Belshazzar, whilst he tasted the wine, commanded to bring the golden and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princesses, his wives and his concubines, might drink therein. Among other problems, Belshazzar was a heavy drinker. They engaged in reveling, effeminate orgies. No other king had carried his impieties to such length. He wanted to mock the God of the Jews, so he ordered that the sacred vessels of the temple be brought, and they would drink their wine that had been offered to their idol gods out of them. Quoting now from the book of Ezra, chapter 1, quote, all the vessels of gold and of silver were 5,400. All these did Sheshbazzar bring up with them out of the captivity that were brought up from Babylon unto Jerusalem. Ezra 1, verse 11, end of quote. Verse 3. Then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem. And the king and his princesses, his wives and his concubines, drank in them. So the waiters were summoned to go over to the trophy house and bring over the golden vessels that had been taken in war, and not only display them, but to desecrate them. Verse 4. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and of silver, of brass, of iron, of wood, and of stone. They not only profaned God's sacred vessels, but they engaged in worshiping idols. It started out to be a royal banquet and turned out to be a religious service to the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. Verse 5. In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. The party is in full swing, music, dancing, fun, when suddenly there's a strange occurrence. A man's hand is writing on the wall. The message is etched into the plaster. The guests probably thought that it was planned and was just some type of magic. But the king knew better. It scared the daylights out of him. He was frightened out of his wits. He knew that this was of God, and so he wanted to find the meaning to the writing. In his consternation, he began to tremor and shake. He was awe-stricken. Verse 6, Then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. The look on his face told the tale. He couldn't hide the quivering and shaking. It was as though a reign of terror had struck the palace. The dread and alarm was written all over his body. His knees began to buckle under him. The word horror-stricken was on his brow. He was lurid and alarmed. So frightful and terrifying was the whole episode that he needed the help and support of his advisers. So he sent for the wise men to help explain the whole affair. Verse 7. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. The king had showed defiance to God, yet all God had to do was to lift up his finger against the king, and he is filled with fear, and his strength departed, and his knees knocked. His face turned ashy pale, his abominable portion of his body began to quiver, and his knees pounded against each other. He has never been so scared in all his life. He calls for the Magi to come and interpret the handwriting. Since it happened in the palace, it surely must pertain to him. It was customary for heathen kings to call for the soothsayers. He's going to use the Babylonian religious quacks to tell him what the message says and what it means. The fact that he promises a huge reward shows that he attached great meaning to the message that he knows has appeared on the wall by a mysterious hand. You will note that he promises the one who solves the riddle to be the third ruler in the kingdom. His father, Nabonidus, was actually king, but was conducting war in another part of the country and left his son Belshazzar in charge of the kingdom. So he could only offer the interpreter to be third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 8. Then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. God had fixed it so they could not read it, and therefore they could not make up an interpretation to it. If they'd have been able to read it, they would have conjured up some counterfeit catch-penny meaning to the phrase on the wall. Verse 9. Then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. The king's apprehension has grown worse by the minute. His most trusted wise men are all bamboozled. The king's countenance was changed. His blood pressure has shot up. He not only is scared, but he's losing patience with the so-called wise men. he senses that they are unable to even weave a cobweb of make-believe. Even his lords are astounded. It's spreading like an infection through the highest of rank. What had happened to the king was contagious and was spreading like a plague. Verse 10. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not thy thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. Now she was probably the queen's mother, what we would call emeritus. She held the title of queen. This strange occurrence has spread like gangrene in the bloodstream. The queen has heard of the handwriting. Perhaps she can remember someone who can solve the equation. Verse 11. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father, made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. The queen remembers when her husband, which was his grandfather, had a dream. You remember the dream? The tree of chapter 4, which had occurred more than 25 years previous, that a man by the name of Daniel, of whom we know as Belshazzar, was possessed with wisdom of the gods and could probably solve the mystery. Verse 12. Forasmuch as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. The queen says, why not let him be called? Grandma's advice is taken, and so the man who is reputed to have surpassing knowledge, understanding, interpreting of dreams, showing of hard sentences, and dissolving doubts, declaring of riddles, solving enigmas, loosing of knots, reversing spells, and solving problems, was sent for. Verse 13. Then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake and said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel which art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? So, you are one of the prisoners that my grandfather brought out of Judah. Mom has told me that you can unravel difficult situations. Verse 14. I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. My grandma says that you are exceeding wise, that you have a spirit of the gods, that light and knowledge radiates through you. Verse 15. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. The king tells Daniel that the wise men, the astrologers, had been baffled, that they had made an effort to decipher it, but could not. The diviners, those who can talk to the dead, they could not read the writing or make known the meaning. The king lets Daniel know that they are at wit's end. So far, he's drawn a blank, and would he or could he help? Verse 16, And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now, if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, Thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. The king tells Daniel that word has reached his palace that he could supply the answer to the handwriting. If so, then he would be made third ruler in the kingdom. Verse 17. Then Daniel answered and said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another, yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. Daniel is not in the business of interpreting dreams and solving problems just for money. He will not be influenced by money. You can give your reward to someone else. However, I will tell you the answer. Verse 18, O thou king, the most high God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. When Daniel uses the word father, he is referring to his ancestry. Sometimes we say we are the children of Abraham, which certainly refers to the ancestry. From the time that Daniel had arrived in Babylon, there has been 4 different kings. Daniel further wants the king to know that the God of heaven had set up this dynasty, and that any glory or honor God had bestowed upon him. Verse 19. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would he slew, and whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, and whom he would he put down. Daniel tells him that God had made the Nebuchadnezzar so great that the whole earth was under their control, that all nations were under the dread of the kings, that the kings had killed who they wanted to, imprisoned whom they desired, exalted whom they pleased, and degraded and put down any that opposed them. Verse 20. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was disposed from his kingly throne, and they took his glory from him. Daniel is not going to interpret this dream without first rebuking the king for his sinful conduct. When his father had hardened his heart, became haughty and stubborn, and filled with arrogance, that God had deposed him from the throne and sent him out to pasture. Verse 21. And he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses. They fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointed over it whomsoever he will. He is here reminding this king that God had done to his grandfather when for 7 years he lived like an animal and ate like an animal. Verse 22, And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this. Like father, like son. Even though the son knew that God had done this, he had let it go in one ear and out the other. Verse 23, But hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives and thy concubines have drunk wine in them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. The culmination of his sins had reached its apex. His spiritual altimeter should have warned him that he never looked at the instrument panel of his life. Not only had he not humbled his heart, but also he had reached the summit against God by defiling the temple vessels. This night he had gone to the extreme. This haughty, arrogant, and pompous disdain of sacred vessels had infuriated God on high. Verse 24. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and this writing was written. So the God of heaven sent him a personal note, informing him that the period of grace was expired and he was calling his hand. Verse 25, and this is the writing that was written, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. The wise men were unable to read or interpret the note on the wall, so Daniel began by first pronouncing the words. Mene is a Chaldea word and is a past participle of Mena. Numbered. Tekel is another Chaldea word meaning to balance. Upharsin, another Chaldea word meaning to split up. So, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin meant numbered, balanced, weighed, divided. When these words are placed together, the sense is not understood, but when considering them in their abstract form, the communication becomes enigmatical and the interpretation would not be likely. Verse 26. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God has numbered thy kingdom and finished it. According to Daniel, the kingdom of Babylon had reached its allotted days. Their number was up. The empire was to end. Verse 27, Tekel, thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. I will describe an old-time balance. We had one on the farm. It consisted of a beam with a center point. This was a neutral point on which the beam pivoted. A weight was placed on one end and the object to be weighed on the opposite end. Daniel tells the king that he had been subjected to the balance beam and that he was lighter than a feather. He didn't weigh any more than a bag full of wind. God had weighed this kingdom on the balance of character, and they lacked in all departments. Verse 28, Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Peres and Upharsin are from the same original word. The word means to split. And that was fitting her because the kingdom that was to take over the Babylonian Empire was split between the Medes and the Persians. Verse 29, Then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. The king did not renege on his promise. However, the rulership was short-lived. Verse 30, In that night was Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, slain. At the age of 62, Darius the Mede took the kingdom. Verse 31, And Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. The Bible only uses 2 verses to describe the fall of the kingdom of gold. Historians take pages after pages to describe how it happened. Here I will give a brief description of the way it happened. While Belshazzar is completing his promise to give Daniel a scarlet robe and a chain of gold and promote him to third ruler in the kingdom, The army of Cyrus was busy diverting the river from its channel and marching their elite forces for a late-night invasion of the city. The prophet Isaiah had prophesied that a gate on the levee would be left open. This was the only way they could get into the city. Sometime after midnight, the Persians entered the city and made their way to the palace. With swords drawn and the party in full swing and nobody armed, they made their way straight to the table of the king and slew him. And in accordance with the word of God, the king was killed, and the kingdom passed into the hands of the Medes and the Persians.